I've had some people asking me last month about Iran. So I thought I'd do a couple of lectures, videos on Iran. I'm not going to do it all in one. It's too much to talk about because it's in the news. We are borderline warfare with Iran, and it's important to understand some things. And what I want to start with the first video is just sort of introductory material because I teach a course in the U.S. and the Middle East. One of the things I've learned over the 16 years I've been teaching is that uh, most students don't know a lot about Iran and don't even understand some of the basics. So probably a lot of you do, but just in case you don't, the first thing to know about Iran is that they're not Arabs. They have their writing looks is derived from Arabic script, but the Iranians are an Indo-European people. They came down out of Western Eurasia the same time the people moved into Greece and Italy and northern India for that matter. So in that sense, if you look at linguistics and genes and stuff, they're more like the Greeks than uh, the Arabs. And it's important to understand because the Iranians hate it when you mistake them for Arabs. And actually, they look down on the Arabs because they had a much more illustrious history, not just years or centuries, but thousands of years before the Arabs. So they do look down on the Arabs and they think that they're not quite as bright as them. The name Iran is interesting because we used to call it Persia. They used to call it Persia. The language is Farsi, which is their way of saying Persian. Iran got the name Iran in the 30s. The Shah of Iran at the time, who was the father of the Shah, was overthrown in 1979, was an admirer of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis who were resurgent there in the 30s. But he also knew that Hitler was an anti-Semite. So he knew that a lot of people in the West lumped in the Persians with the Arabs as if they were all Arabs. And Arabs, of course, are Semites, like the Jews. The Jews and the Arabs are Semites. So if Hitler was anti-Semitic, possibility he also might be anti-Arab, which wasn't true. But so the Shah decided to change the name of Persia to uh, what was, for Hitler, the big people, the people you wanted to be like were the Aryans, the Aryan races. So he changed the name of Persia to Iran, which in Farsi is how you say Aryan. So basically, the name Iran means it's Aryan nation, if you want to look at it that way. Uh, the Persians were the first big empire in Western Eurasia. I mean, long before the Europeans. I mean, the Europeans were living in huts. The Persians had an empire that stretched from Libya all the way to India. They had the first leader, their Shah and Shah of Shahs, Emperor of Emperors, who got the name Great. We have Alexander the Great, you have Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great. Well, they had Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great was a great leader, military commander. He died fighting in India, but he took the Persian Empire about as far as it could go, given the technologies of the time. The Persians did all kinds of things in their empire that were first. They had roads, they built roads, they had a postal system. They broke the place down into subsidiary, states, satraps they called them. Each one had a governor who was considered a Shah. That's why the Shah is the Shah of Shahs, Shah of Shah, um, Emperor of Kings, if you want. And they did all these things long before anybody else was doing them. They could put together an enormous army, which is why they could conquer. Now the problems was just distance. It's hard to maintain and move that army under the size of the empire from in the West, Libya, to all the way to India. It's just enormous. Remember that everybody's walking around or moving on mules in these periods. Three times they invaded Greece, and they almost won, but they didn't, and they were indeed stopped. Now, it's also true if you look at the Persians who exist. They were the Achaemenids and the Sassanids and this group and that group. There are all kinds of names. They're always the same people. Uh, they also have a history of a quick collapse. Alexander the Great went in there, and in 10 years, the whole thing fell apart for a variety of reasons that I don't have time to go into in this. But the idea that they can't collapse, or and again, my point isn't to say that if we get into a war with them, they're going to fall apart. But keep in mind they have done the big El Foldo twice at least. The other time was when the Arab invasions came, and the Persians have been around for millennia, and it had been conquered once by Alexander. The Arabs came in a couple of years, they did the whole thing all over again. Persian Empire collapsed, the Arabs conquered the whole thing. Now, eventually, the Persians regained bureaucratic control and everything else. But in the meantime, they had been converted from their religion, Zoroastrianism, which some people would argue was actually the first monotheism. Now, it became sort of polytheistic later on under the Persian Empire for political reasons. But originally, it was monotheistic. And it's a very interesting religion to look at if you look at some of the carryovers into what becomes Christianity. But they were monotheistic. They had one of these great religions. They had all these things going for them, but they still collapsed, basically because I would argue that they always had their aristocracy ruled. Because whoever the ruling class was, they ruled, and the people were really kind of out of it. Unlike in the Greek and Roman situations, you had some input coming in from the lower classes. You had none. And a lot of mismanagement, a lot of corruption, a lot of overtaxation is what probably led to the periodic quick collapse of the Iranians. Now, again, I'm not predicting that if we get into a war with them, they're going to fall apart and the mullahs are going to get overthrown. That's not my point. But don't go the other way and think, they've been around for thousands of years. That could never happen, because it has happened. Alexander went in with 45,000 men. This is an area that was huge. It was from Libya to India, and he conquered with 45,000 men. There were, the Iranians were Persians were fielding hundreds of thousands of men and still losing. So, just keep all that in mind. Now, that they've been basically a Muslim part of the Muslim part of the world, the Islamic part of the world, since roughly the 7th century. As I said, they pretty much regained control of the old Persian heartland, away from the Arabs, who, as I said, they looked down on. And the other thing to keep in mind is that they adopted the Shia branch of Islam, which goes back to the 8th and some extent the 7th century. So they are Shia Muslims. Most of the other Muslims in the world are Sunni Muslims. So they're different. You see Shia Muslims in there, you see some in Lebanon, some in Yemen, a lot of the Gulf states, Bahrain, the Emirates. There are a lot of the eastern part of Saudi Arabia is mostly Shia. And they work through these groups to undermine the Bahrainis, the Saudis, and everything else. The Iraqis are, for the most part, Arabs, unlike the Iranians. But about 2/3 of the Iraqis, more or less 60%, something like that, are also Shia, whereas the rest of the Arabs are Sunnis, or the Kurds, who are also Sunnis. So there are lots of these divisions in this area. And the Iranians have had, the mullahs have been in charge now since 1979. And I would argue that they are the original Islamic State. We talked a lot about the Islamic State, which existed for a few years in parts of Syria, Iran. But these guys are the original Islamic State. They are a state committed to establishing Islam throughout the world. Of course, their version of Islam, Shia Islam, and I'm not going to go into the differences and how that came up and what the differences are between the two, as to say that they're real. And for some of these people, they're enough to kill people with. You saw ISIS was routinely killing Shia Muslims because they see them as heretics, basically, and vice versa. So the Shia often see the Sunnis as heretics. So these are real deep religious divides, which I know to us doesn't seem to be a big deal. I mean, Catholics and Protestants get together, and Jews and Christians seem to get along together. But remember, Islam is 700 years younger than Christianity. So just look at the Christian world in 1300. What was it doing? When did we stop killing each other for religious reasons? After the 30 Years' War in the 1600s? So, keep these things in mind. We're dealing here with different time frames and different time scales. But the Iranians have been around a long time. I mean, far longer than us. I mean, they have a history that goes back literally thousands of years. Maybe not quite as far back as the Egyptians, but pretty far back. And it's been an illustrious history. They invented astronomy. They invented, you could argue, administration. They invented all these other things. They have a lot to be proud of, and not just buildings. I mean, they did a lot of things. They've been around for a very long time. They're a very proud people with an illustrious history. And as we move forward with them, we have to understand these things. But they're not Arabs, and they're not Supermen. They are capable of getting out ahead of their skis, which frequently Iranian regimes have done, and doing a very quick fold against in the face of very small attacks. When the Arabs invaded in the 7th century, they were heavily outnumbered by the Persians, but they won. And not only did the Persians lose, the empire just fell apart. They collapsed again, actually a third time. The Persians had sort of regained control of that area and up into Central Asia. And then came the Mongols. And when the Mongols came in, they collapsed it again. And the Mongols overran everything, all the way from Central Asia, all the way to, they got as far as Damascus, and down into what today is the area of the West Bank. They took Baghdad twice. Turks took Baghdad twice and destroyed everything. So you could argue that 3 times in history, the Persians, the Iranians, have done a collapse. So that's just something to keep in mind. Again, I'm not predicting a collapse if we get in a war with them, but it wouldn't shock me if it happened, because they frequently make big mistakes and, like I said, get out over their skis and end up hitting a tree or something. So that's sort of it for the first lecture, and then I'll move on to some other related topics.